Hello. Okay. So I just wanted to read this book tonight that is, excuse me, um, called Father Tom of Connemara. Now, before I get into reading this book, I tried to do a little research on the author, Elizabeth O'Reilly Neville, and I could not find any information on her. I probably did not um, exhaust all means of looking things up. I probably could find something at the library if they have a database to look through things but I didn't have the time to do that. But as far as I know, this book is a novel. So the character of Father Tom is not a real person. So I will stay in my lane and talk about what I do know as far as what this book is about. Now, this book is I was reading, and this kind of book is a biographical narrative. So this exact person named Father Tom might be based off of a real person, and um, but essentially a biographical narrative is a portrayal of a life that doesn't have the need for um, fact or a comprehensive account of the person's birth to their death. So it just tells you the story of this person's life, but I've looked this book up too, and it's categorized as a novel. So that's why I'm like, okay, is it a biography or is it a novel? And so that's the other thing I was having issues with. But anyway, enough of book talk. We should get into it. So, first, I would like to read the dedication in the front because it's very sweet. To the memory of John O'Reilly, C.E., and in grateful remembrance of his sojourn among the hospitable people of the incomparable Irish Highlands, this volume is dedicated by his affectionate daughter. Father Tom of Connemara. Father Tom. A man he was to all his country dear, and passing rich on £40 a year. Goldsmith. History is always repeating itself. Goldsmith's words could just as well have been written of the Reverend Thomas McDermott, who ruled over the spiritual affairs of the people of a strip of the wild west coast of Galway and the adjacent islands some years ago, as of the celebrated Vicar of Auburn. Connemara lies on the uttermost verge of the most western island of Europe, and is the last spot on which the sun rests before he is lost to the eyes of men. The great luminary lingers as if loath to part with his last and fairest love of his, and waits to paint with crimson and gold the mountains and glens and bays and lakes before he sinks slowly into his ocean bed. And that bed, who can describe it? Was ever couch so well prepared to receive a royal visitor? Its covering is first crimson and gold, caught up with diamonds, and then crimson and purple and gold, and diamonds again, sparkling and glinting and changing with every restless movement of the royal guest, until sleep finally overtakes him, and the moon comes sailing along ready to keep guard over his slumbers. The moon is an artist too, but her brushes are dipped in silver, and she uses them with more sparing hand. Under her touch the mountains and glens and lakes and bays take on an unearthly beauty. Connemara is the same, yet not the same. Under the sun's triumphant coloring, one glories in her physical loveliness, but the moon has shown us that she has a soul, and we can hear her heartbeats. Ah, she is telling her story now to even the most unimaginative. The story of her youth and her triumphs, of her loves and her losses, and our hearts go out to her in a great tenderness. Connemara has shared in the history of her country to a great extent, and the moon is busy pointing out what the glories of the sun almost obscure, as too sad for the light, the raths and cromlechs and hill forts and cahirs and castles, by their ruins She is telling her story, and we must needs listen. We find ourselves counting the bones and measuring the dust of the warriors who lie at rest under the old monuments, the men who lived and built and strove so many years against an overwhelming destiny, and we feel a great pity. Are they at rest? Maybe, but the air seems full of them. One can hear their ships grounding on the shore, laden with the triumphs of the successful navigators, the youths who 1,500 years before the dawn of Christianity sailed the known and unknown world, and dared the Norsemen in their northern seas, and later Brendan, the navigator and missionary, who brought Christianity to the Germans. Ah, those were Irishmen to be proud of. Castleen, Non Circe, and Augnier castles, still in a good state of preservation, where the courtyards and huge towers and drawbridges, representing the once great families of O'Connor, O'Flaherty, Blake, and Bourke, are peeled again with fierce and busy warriors. How tenderly the moon deals with them, and how fair are the faces that are peeping out at them from the turreted windows overhead and praying for their success. The kingdom of Connemara, as it was formerly styled, was almost inaccessible and very little known, a refuge for outlaws where the king's writ could not run. A great writer once wrote, but she meant an English king. The government has now made some fine roads, and the railroads run from Galway to the principal towns, but what road has ever been cut through these almost impassable mountains? This was what we want to come at England's idea of people who strive to hold their own. Outlaws, of course, and this brings us to the kernel of our story. The kingdom of Connemara was the last stronghold of proud outlaws who never gave in to the ruling of the stranger. They fought against oppression foot to foot, and disputed possession inch by inch, and then accepted poverty and liberty rather than the permission to hold their estates under an English right and an English title. These were reinforced by the contingent sent by the God-fearing Cromwell, who drove defenseless women and children, those who escaped his butchery, into hell or Connaught, because he had promised their rich estates to his followers. Connemara is admirably fitted for a stronghold. It occupies the promontory between Killarney and Galway bays on the west coast of Ireland, and is bounded on the east by two great lakes, Corrib and Mask. Few penetrated beyond these, and few tourists venture, even now, beyond the beaten paths, and the real Connemara, the land of the Gael, is little known, and its people are left undisturbed in their traditions and customs and language. The Irish Highlands, says Mrs. Hall, writing 60 years ago, are peopled by a brave and hardy race, attached as all mountaineers are to their wild hills and glens, and retaining largely their original character, though civilization has made its way where the invader could never enter. Their habits and customs are comparatively as little changed as their mountains, lakes, and old ocean, the natural barriers by which their kingdom is encompassed. Mrs. Hall forgets that these Highlanders are the sons of princes, and must necessarily retain something of the bravery as well as the courtesy of their forefathers. Life was hard for the ancestors of the fishermen and farmers who tried to wrest a living from the mountains and the sea, but few thought of seeking new fields, for those who did returned to die and leave their bones among their kin. Those ancestors are not dead in the real sense of the word, for they live in the hearts of their descendants. They are talked of and sung of and dreamt of at each fireside, from Killarney to Galway bays, and from Lough Mask to Lough Corrib, and they ran no danger of being forgotten, even if the storyteller is silent, for the effigies in stone and marble lie around them in the old churchyard, and their monuments are the forts and cairns and towers that rest on every hillside and tell the story of their resistance to tyranny, better even than song or story. Each Connemara man holds his head high, and he has reason for doing so. He may be a fisherman depending on the elements for his breakfast, or a farmer breaking his heart over a crop that would evoke a curse from the heart of a Roscommon cotter, but he comes from royal blood, and he knows it, and is deeply thankful. He is brave because his ancestors were brave. He is hospitable because they were hospitable, and he is courteous because they were courteous. His dinner may consist of some potatoes and a freshly caught salmon, or potatoes and milk, or potatoes and nothing at all, but he invites you to partake of it with the dignity of a prince. Father Tom, who was Stroth in the Latin, told his parishioners that Connemara signified bays of the sea, which indeed was evident enough, as the sea was plentiful and introduced itself into their potato field in every conceivable shape, the narrowest body of water being called a gap. The mountains are nearly as numerous as the bays, and though clothed with beauty even to the water's edge, their barren sides give but little return for the husbandman's exertions. It takes twice, nay 3 times as much labor to grow a potato or an ear of wheat in Connemara as in the rich and level lands adjoining, but the Highlanders are content with little. When they are not fishing, however, they are farming, and when they are doing neither, they are gathering the kelp or burning it for manure, so that time never hangs heavy in Connemara. The women's fingers keep pace with their tongues even when they are busy gossiping. Their stories may grow in their passage from one to the other, but the long stockings which they carry in their hands are growing too, and the needles fly in and out like streaks of lightning from overcharged clouds as they pass over Da Bain Dig. Sorry, probably said that wrong. Meanwhile, under the ground where the crops grow so scantily, the real wealth of the district is lying in silver, copper, marble, and even gold. If there were only capital enough to mine for them, the people need not be so poor. But being poor does not keep the people from being happy. Even in the hardest times, there is always a fresh batch of jokes to be retold, or a wedding to be talked of, or a funeral in prospect. It may seem strange to associate the idea of death with happiness, but in these cases the funeral is not theirs, and there is always a chance of meeting friends and neighbors and enjoying oneself in a round of comfortable, complacent, irresponsible grief and gossip. There is an exception to this, and that is when a fishing boat comes in, bottom up after a storm, telling its own story of loss to the widow and orphan. There are tears then, and lamentations, the most poetic that were ever sung or said by poet or bard from Ossian and Homer down to the present day. Death by drowning is the one thing to be bitterly mourned, for are these friends not taken away in all their youth and strength without a chance of saying a last goodbye? Such funerals are sad indeed, the sadness being trebly augmented by the presence of the pipers, with their lamentations that are enough to wake the dead from the neighboring graveyards. But when the storm ceases and their treacherous seas become calm again, and the sun shines on the beautiful mountains, and the multitudinous wildflowers mingle their scents with the gorse and the heather, the people forget their woe, and are happy again until the next boat comes in bottom up, and revives their grief. If you entered Connemara by the east, the shores of the Atlantic were always open, and Connemara girls were noted for their beauty. Fishermen from Donegal and Antrim, from Scotland and Spain and France, were often wafted there, and with the freemasonry of their craft made themselves acquainted quickly. They came again and again, attracted by the hospitality and friendship, and incidentally the pretty girls. The time came when these visits ended in weddings, and the visitors stayed indefinitely. Thus a mixed race sprang up, and French and Spanish names were heard with those indigenous to the soil, and those whose faces bore the coloring of France and Spain mended the nets and sailed the blue waters in search of fish, and gradually became more Irish than the Irish themselves. When Father Tom McDermott was sent to Connemara fresh from college, much regret was indulged in by his friends, who considered the time spent there as so much of his promising career thrown away. The young priest agreed with them at first, and though he admired his surroundings very much, counted the hours to his recall. It came in due course, but Father Tom, as he was soon called, was not ready. He had asked for an extension of time. 2 years more went by, but he was never quite ready to leave. His curly black hair was mixed with gray, and his rosy cheeks had taken on the shade that shows a man's life is spent in the open, and when the fiat came from which there is no excuse, he obeyed, but returned again with a welcome from himself that nearly equaled the welcome accorded to him by the people who loved him and wanted him, and with whom he remained till his death. I'm going to pause here. I will continue where I left off the other day. He identified himself with the interests of the community, wept with the sorrowful, and laughed with the happy, and when it was necessary, acted the part of a reformer with a muscular hand, as we shall soon see. Father Tom's parish was very scattered, and the greater part of his time was spent on the back of his sure-footed pony. They were as well known as the Peak of Mount Turk. He attended the weddings as well as the funerals, and enjoyed himself at the former almost as much as the groom, or more so, for the groom was often troubled about the fee, and he always opened the dance with the bride. Father Tom was by no means perfect. He had his likes and dislikes. He liked a good dinner and a good fee, and a good book to read. He disliked all shams, pretenders, and humbugs. In extenuation, we must all allow that he was always ready to share a meal, or to distribute the fee, after fighting hard for it, among those who stood in need, or to lend the book that pleased him, though eccentric. Father Tom did everything with a good motive, and he was as successful as Solomon in deciding matters justly. Though tolerant with weakness, Father Tom was severe with pretenders, and did not try to break the force of their fall when their time came. His well-worn coat and ungarnished, simple manner were very misleading, and many a visitor who had intended to be condescending with the apparently easy-going cleric, and let him down easy, was so stunned by his own fall as to forget to see stars. We are always sorry for the clergymen from Kilrush or Galway or Dublin or London even, who, not being aware of Father Tom's scholarship, was tempted to take a rise out of the mountainly priest. Father Tom was designedly an easy victim. He would be the butt of the company for a while, for apparently his classics had grown rusty, to say the least, so far from civilization. To the callow, fledgling fresh from college, he was merciful and kind to the blatant blather, who tried to show off his superficial knowledge at the expense of others. He was severity itself. Such men aroused his just wrath, as he always arose to the occasion. He baited the unfortunate critic with tidbits from Virgil, and jogged him through Cicero, as his would-be critic halted and stumbled. He pelted him with Homer, and rattled him with Xenophon, till he succeeded in making the company blush for him, and then suggested a course of study to be pursued in order to become tolerably proficient in Latin and Greek before his next visit to the Irish Highlands. In general, however, Father Tom was good-natured and not easily disturbed. Father Tom was the clergyman who was often quoted at dinner parties for the amusing habit of advertising lost and found articles before the Sunday morning sermons. The people who laughed so heartily at those anecdotes knew not the land of the Gael. They knew nothing about his parish or its needs. They did not know that it was what it was to be without a local newspaper, or to go without seeing their friends and neighbors from one week's end to the other, and then only at Mass on Sunday, or for a few minutes outside the church door after the services were over, when was gleaned all the news of the week. A Sunday in Connemara was a pleasant day. It meant not only a visit to the church, but a day of rest, and a sight of one's sweetheart or neighbor in their best clothes and with their best company manners. It meant also a sight of the old neighbors and long dead and gone friends, or rather their resting places in the moss-covered graveyards, where the old inhabitants were fast going to join them. In those days, good roads were few, and only disinterested and unselfish men could keep pace, as Father Tom did, with the demands of his time that must necessarily arise from such a scattered district. He knew all the shortcuts in the mountain paths, and his pony was never known to stumble. He also knew the caves better than did the gougers, who were often on the search for private distilleries, and were as often lost, and he was as skilful in handling an oar or guiding a cork from point to point as the humblest of his parishioners. We will not attempt to give the full history of Father Tom's unusual life, nor apologize for naming our sketches after this good, if not great man. They speak of his people, and when we speak of them, we speak of him, for he was closely identified with every soul in his parish. Father Tom was a man who garnered not nor gathered into barns. His house was always open to the unfortunate and the stranger, and not having any bank account when he died, His loss was felt as keenly by his relatives as by his friends. No one wanted to read the will, and he was carried to his grave near the sea by his parishioners, who watered the hallowed spot with their tears. "Peace be to your ashes, Father Tom. You did good and not evil all the days of your life." A man may die and be mourned while the clods are falling on his coffin, and when the mourners have gone home, there may be a faithful heart or two who will think of him with tears for a while, and keep his grave green for a while. Then the weeds overrun it, and the children run over it, and even the name of the man who once inhabited the body that is mouldering into dust beneath their feet is forgotten. He may have been a bishop and won a ring, or a man who founded a family, or a merchant whose ship sailed the main. It's all the same. His day of oblivion has come. There is one man, however, who has lived in the hearts of 2 generations, whose grave can be seen far out at sea, and is always saluted by the fishermen, with bare heads, as they round the curve, no matter what the weather may be. The graveside reads thus: Reverend Thomas McDermott, requisite in pace. Land of the gale, it is hard to describe thee, land of the wonderful 12 pins, whose tops almost touch the clouds, and whose variety of texture and shade can never be fully told. Who can describe thee? Thy glories of sea and sky, mountain and bay are eternal, and the spectator is mute with surprise and awe. All right. I apologize if my voice is very scratchy. I'm getting over a cold, but that was the first chapter of Father Tom of Connemara. And I know it's a long video, but we'll see. I'm hoping to gradually read through this, and anyway, have a good evening.